Welcome, welcome.
This is a quick screenshot from Indeed.com, careers in ontology, paying £100,000 a year or more. You can see this isn't sitting around in your armchair thinking about philosophy. This is actually doing it. This is how we build databases and data science systems and AI and languages. In order to do that, though, you will have to engage with some current debates about what these ontologies should be going into those systems. What are people still arguing about 2,500 years after Aristotle started this research area? So, time and events. We've talked a bit about space and the need for dedicated spatial databases. What about time? So, some facts seem to exist outside of time. Okay, roses are red. This is a fact about the abstract class of roses, which has never been instantiated. Roses just are red. They're not red at 3 o'clock this morning. They're always red, or they just are red. Okay. How about my car is blue? So this doesn't have a capital. This is lowercase. So my car is an instance. But most of the time, I want to argue about my car. I'm happy that it just is blue. Not that it is blue between the years 2016 and 2030, which is probably more correct. It probably isn't blue. In fact, it isn't even my car or even a car outside of those times. So, when should we switch from my car is blue to when is my car blue? 1 + 1 = 2. This is a mathematical fact. All mathematical facts seem to exist outside of time and space. You find this in many religious beliefs. This is Kali dancing on Shiva. Shiva is the god of creativity and fun and enjoyment, and Kali is kind of the female goddess of middle-aged domestication and settling down, and she's dancing on the dead body of Shiva here. And as in many myths, this is presented as something that just exists. Kali does dance on the body of Shiva. It's not something that happened in the past or will happen in the future. It's just a property of Kali and Shiva. It's the same in Norse mythology. People argue about when is the Ragnarok, the fall of Valhalla. Is it the end of the world that will happen? Did it already happen? And those stories exist outside of time. So if you want to build AI systems that are talking about fiction, literature, mythology, how are you going to represent those kinds of events that don't have a timestamp in the way that a financial database would have a timestamp? Other kinds of facts are inherently about time, about instants or intervals of time. So I do some research on computer music, and I deal with objects like this. A song is made of a verse, a chorus, a verse, and the chorus. This is an object, and it has parts. But rather than Kali is an object with arguably physical parts. She's got 8 arms, whatever. Each of those arms is a part of Kali, but in a song, the parts exist over time. The verse takes place, and then the chorus takes place, and then this verse takes place. So, what does it mean for an object to have parts that are separated by time rather than by space? This also comes up in work I do on transport data science. So in transport, we often want to represent events like the overtaking of one car by another. So you might try and put it in a database like this. You say car 1 overtook car 2 at this timestamp. Okay, but what exactly is this ontologically? This is written as a relation between apparently 3 substances, 2 cars and a time. So this is committing you to a belief that time is a substance, which seems kind of suspicious. There are other ontologies called event ontologies where rather than substances existing as primary, it's an event that is primary. And an event can include one or more substances doing certain things at a particular point of time or an interval in time. So you might want to treat this overtaking, the overtaking with a capital O maybe, kind of as a substance, or as a separate thing called an event. There is an overtaking. But if you do that, now you need to go back to ontologies like this music ontology, and now you've got to explain what on earth was going on there now, because there's no such thing as a chorus anymore. Rather, there was some chorusing taking place between this time and this other time. So kind of extreme event ontologies will abandon the notion of an object altogether and only talk about events and processes. Rather than saying there is a bird over there, you can say there is some birding taking place between 3 p.m. and 3:02 at this location. There is some birding. That's an event, and there isn't a substance called a bird anymore. So very often you will see time is kind of bolted onto an ontology as an afterthought, especially in the databases that you will actually work with. You'll see financial databases with all this information about company accounts and who owes what to who. And then someone says, oh, but now we need a temporal version. So let's put a timestamp on everything and have multiple versions of all those facts as they existed at different points in time. And then you'll get into these huge ontological arguments about how you define an event and a process and a sequence of time. What does it mean for 2 units of time to overlap, and so on. And this also shows up in verification, especially hardware verification. You would like to prove theorems with your logic systems, such as this system will exist in certain states at certain times, or there is no time at which the system will crash. Well, very common to see these temporal logics showing up in hardware verification, sometimes in software verification as well. So that's time, events, processes. Modal ontologies. Modal refers to this idea of possible worlds that we've touched on before. There are logics where you can say it is necessarily true that X, and it is possible that Y. Okay, and you can build your logical rules out of this notation. So when you have a modal logic, you then need a modal ontology to go with it as the structure that it's going to talk about. So dealing with possible worlds is somewhat like dealing with time. You're talking about all the different ways that the world could be in simultaneously. Is the car at location 1 or location 2? It might be at 2 locations at different times, or it might be at 2 locations in different possible worlds that you'd like to talk about and reason about with your logic. This isn't an armchair philosophy thing. This is a very real, practical decision-making thing. Unactualized possible worlds have very measurable real effects on the actual world. Okay, so part of my research is to do with studying people crossing the road in front of self-driving cars. And we use game theory to study this. The same kind of game theory that is used in nuclear warfare and business deal modeling. And the way you model all these scenarios is you consider the possible world where the worst has happened. The cars have crashed, everyone fires their nuclear missiles, we leave the European Union with no deal. There's a threat on the table. Everyone puts this possible world threat on the table where everyone is going to lose. And no one wants to actually end up in that world. No one wants it to be actualized. But everyone is thinking primarily about that world. And you can work backwards in time to figure out how to avoid it, basically. So the actions that you actually take, such as stepping into the road or not stepping into the road, or firing the nuclear missiles or not firing the missiles, the actions you actually take have been decided upon through this consideration of possible worlds that don't actually take place. No one is ever really going to fire the nuclear missiles, but They have to exist and they have to be pointed at each other so that people can reason in this way to figure out what they're actually going to do. And the philosopher David Lewis has quite recently argued for the realism of possible worlds. He says in science, any entity which has a measurable, observable effect on the world you're in should be considered real. So, you believe in quantum fields because you can design a bunch of experiments whose outcome depends on what the fields were doing. And David Lewis argues that possible worlds have exactly the same status. They're theoretical entities that you make up, you reason about them, and they have an effect on what you actually observe. So they're no different from all the other entities that you reason about. So we talked about Kripke before. Kripke invented this logic, modal logic. He invented the rules and the theorems of it, and then Lewis has provided the ontology, the interpretation of it. And again, this is very real. This all shows up in hardware verification regularly now. You'd like to say there is no possible world in which my system, my ALU, will give the wrong number. If only Intel had done that before the famous floating point bug. So you see these logics being implemented in automated verification systems and used for real to develop the hardware. And then holes I've alluded to. Ontologies often struggle with negatives. So suppose John has a chronic illness requiring delivery of a medicine every day, and it shows up at 9 o'clock in the morning every day for 20 years. And so if John was going to write his diary on a typical day, he's almost certainly not going to write my medicine arrived at 9 o'clock, because that's just what happens every day. It's like writing I got up and I breathed some air and drank some water. It's so obvious that you don't even notice it anymore. And then one day, the medicine does not come. Okay. So the absence of this event is potentially the most important moment of John's life. Okay, this is a major life-threatening event for John, the non-delivery of the medicine. And the problem is your database cannot represent this. Your database only represents things that happen. The medicine is delivered with this timestamp. So your database probably looks like this, okay? And this has got a missing day, I think. Look, the medicine came on the 1st and the 2nd, and it didn't come on the 3rd, and it came on the 4th. But you haven't represented the major event in John's life, the non-delivery of the medicine on that day. So you would like to have this other type of non-physical entity, called an absence or a hole. This is a temporal absence. You can also have physical absences. Someone shows up with a hole in their head. You'd really like to put that in your database. The patient has a hole in their head. But what is a hole? It's the absence of stuff. So the feminist philosophers have explored this. The male genitalia are a positive object. They protrude into space and they have an extension. There is a region of space that is occupied by male genitalia, whereas female genitalia are the absence of space. They are a hole in the body. And for that reason, it seems much harder to name them than it does for the male genitalia. Feminist philosophers have got interested in this part of ontology for that reason. There are ontologies where you describe the world in terms of information rather than either the perceptual world or the physical world, which may have some answers to this. What you really want in your database is information about what is different every day. If it's a normal day, you don't say anything because the medicine gets delivered at 9 o'clock every day. It's not interesting. The information comes on the day that it's missing. That's what you'd write in your diary. My medicine did not come today. Maybe I will die. If you push that all down to the ontological level, if the information itself is what exists, maybe you have a better theory of how to make positive and negative entities more equivalent to one another. So those are all still fairly unsolved problems and research areas. But we do have people computationalizing all of this, with varying degrees of success. There are fields of science where ontology is used every day, routinely. So let's look at how these models have become computationalized. Okay, in the late 1800s, Brentano took Aristotle's categories and arranged them. This is the tenfold distinction. Okay? He arranged them into a hierarchy. And this is a hierarchy of entities. Okay, anything that exists, or bees, anything that bees is an entity or a being. And you can divide them into substance, and substance, by definition, you can't say anything more about. Substance is just substance. And he has this collection of categories called accidents, consisting of properties and relations. And then the properties in the tenfold distinction you can divide into these inherent properties, which have numerical values, what are called directed properties. So this is to do with being active and passing, or having things, being at a location, and containment is something inside something else. Is it inside a temporal interval or a spatial interval? So since then, it's become a popular pastime, in philosophy at least, to argue about what this tree should look like. What are all the different categories and how should they be arranged in an ontological tree? And that has come down to us in computer science now. The current state of the art, or one of three competing state of the arts, arguably, is called BFO, the Basic Formal Ontology, as defined in 2012 by Barry Smith and colleagues. Historical philosophers have names like Aristotle and Brentano, and now they're called Barry Smith. So this is an ontology that is really used in a lot of science now. This is instantiated in XML and in object-oriented languages, and database schemas. And it begins with entity. Entity is split into what are called occurrents, which are roughly temporal things like events and processes, and continuants, which are things that stick around roughly. So things that stick around can be independent, which means they exist without needing anything else to exist, or they can be dependent. Okay, so independent continuants can be material entities, which get instantiated as objects, or they can be immaterial entities like wholes, these negative entities that we've talked about. So these objects, this is roughly what Aristotle meant by substance. These are objects that can exist by themselves, whereas these things rely on an object in order to come into existence. So you'll find properties over here, such as qualities and roles, and a disposition turns out to be something useful. This is something that an object could do but isn't necessarily currently doing. It's a property of a hammer that it could be used for hitting nails. That's pretty much the most important property of the hammer, but it's not something that the hammer is actually doing right now. It's something that it could do in the future. So roughly we've got substances over here and predicates over here, and we've got classes sitting in the middle. So in this ontology, the property of being a hammer, membership of the class of hammers becomes a predicate of this particular substance that is instantiating the hammerness. Now, BFO is important because it's been designed very carefully using the whole history of ontology from Aristotle. And it's been designed as a single unifying upper ontology, which all other ontologies can inherit from and extend in their own ways. So it's very important to get this right. And as with all unifying standards, we currently have three of them. There's BFO and Dolce and Sumo are the other competing upper ontologies.
There's
This is what
3 different standards? That's
yeah,
crazy. We need to create one unifying standard so that everyone doesn't have to choose between them.
Let's make a new standard to unify them together, sure. So this is what one particular instantiation of BFO looks like. This is in the language OWL. So OWL is actually a meta-ontology. It's the web ontology language, which is misspelled as OWL because it sounds cool, like a bird. So OWL is a schema of XML which is used for specifying ontologies. So it's actually a meta-ontology. But in this case, we're specifying BFO using OWL, and you can see all your favorite XML stuff is in here. And this is a tiny fragment of it. You can see the whole lot sitting up on GitHub and in some other places. Now, this is talking about space and regions of space and what it means for a region to be part of another region. So you can see lots of English comments. There's a big book which defines the meanings in more English. But the idea is it's a completely general upper ontology, like what Aristotle was doing, but modernized with these ideas about time and negative spaces and modalities and so on. And it's designed so that your favorite logic system can use it as the structure for its logic. So for example, there's an Isabelle instantiation of this. That means you can now define stuff in your world in these terms, put it into Isabelle, and then do theorem proving as a form of AI. And yeah, this should work much better than Prolog, because Prolog is stuck in logical atomism, where there's only substances and relations. What you have here is potentially an updated version of Prolog, where you have a much more believable underlying ontology that is able to represent the world in a more accurate sense, at least with respect to the human perceptual world, if not the underlying noumenal world. So the upper ontologies are that's a very macho world to be in. We're going to define the ontology of the world. And we're going to compete with these 2 other guys who are also defining the ontology of the world. That's a pretty rarefied research niche to exist in. What you find most careers in ontology, like the job ads we just saw, are in what is called lower ontology, and these are domain-specific ontologies. Ideally, they're going to hang off of BFO or one of the others. So this also goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle didn't just do philosophy; he did other what are now called sciences, like biology. Didn't really make much of a distinction between them at the time. But what you see here is he's taken his concept of substance and then extended it even further down. So he's now going to divide substance into immobile and mobile substances. Immobile substance is basically God or the universe or both. Mobile substance is everything else, body. And mobile substances were divided into eternal mobile substances and destructible substances. And at the time, it was thought that things in the heavens were eternal and things on the earth were destructible. And then he divides them into things that have souls and things which don't have souls. So anything without a soul is an element, and anything with a soul is a living thing. And then we're going to divide living things into things that can have perception and don't have perception, which gives you plants and animals. Things capable of perception can be rational or irrational, and that's humans versus everything else. And then irrational animals are going to split into those which have blood and without blood. You can keep on going. Things with blood, quadrupeds, fish, birds. That's going to take you to mammals versus egg layers, and keep going until you get to human beings or wherever you're heading for. So, modern biology doesn't use quite this categorization, but it uses a similar idea. nowadays looking like this. Yeah, so we have, this is the tree of life. So you can say all vertebrates are animals, and fish are vertebrates, and so on. You know, mammals are animals, or flowering plants are plants. Most of life went off over here to form bacteria. There's a second branch that came off called archaea. These are things which look and act just like bacteria, but genetically are completely different, and they're more closely related to other stuff over here. And you've got things like fungi. Fungi aren't quite plants; they're a different kind of thing. But you know, all of this relies on the idea of an object and a property in the first place, and then you can break it down in terms of how your domain is structured. Yeah, is a virus a living thing? Discuss. Interesting. So in biology, this has really worked. Okay, the biologists have taken BFO, the basic form of ontology, and they've extended it into the gene ontology, beginning in 1998. And so this is a tiny fragment of the gene ontology. This is trying to describe all knowledge about genes, both their structure and their temporal processes. Remember, both of those things exist in BFO. So I think here we're looking at part of the process tree hanging off of BFO, and you can see like, this is all possible biological processes. This will inherit from the BFO process. And then we're going to split that into signaling processes, regulatory processes, cellular processes, and you know, you can keep going down to these very specific concepts, you know, the negative regulation of signal transduction. And biology really needs this now, because there's so much biology that no human being can know it all anymore. It has to be automated. It has to be put in a database, and you need an AI system that can query the database and answer questions like, what should we try for a COVID vaccine, being the most obvious recent one. So the full gene ontology, last time I looked, it was representing around 700,000 facts extracted manually in the first case from 150,000 biology papers. There are now many more facts are automatically extracted from those papers using NLP and sitting on the ontology. And you know, the dream is we put all of biology into this database. You know, every time someone does an experiment and discovers this thing interacts with that thing, it's going to go in the database. And because you have the ontology, all the scientists in biology can talk the same language. They can make the results of their experiments compatible with one another, and they can easily find answers to those questions. So here in Lincoln, we have a lot of work on agricultural technology, specifically plants. We don't really do animals in Lincoln. So in plant biology, we've extended it again. We've taken the gene ontology and built in a load of extra stuff now, describing the specific structures of plants. The gene ontology only talks about microscopic biology. In the plant ontology, we also want to talk about what is called the phenotype or phenomics. That means how the genes are instantiated into physical properties of the plants. You know, that includes botany, you know, the physical sizes of parts of plants. It includes processes. How does the plant change over time? Which parts are growing in response to what? But it all has to be linked back to the genetics. So you can ask questions which hit on both the gene ontology and the plant ontology because they're compatible with one another. So gene ontology is grown out of BFO, and plant ontology extends gene ontology. So you know, here we've got plant anatomical entities, we've got plant growth and development stages. This is a more process, temporal aspect. And again, you know, many thousands of new categories being defined in a lower ontology, which you can read about here. And you can keep on going, right? This is work that is in progress now. Lincoln has had some involvement in this through a European consortium called Emphasis. An emphasis is developing the plant phenotyping ontology. So the plant ontology only talks about plants. It has facts about plants, whereas phenotyping means the process of doing experiments on plants. Yeah, and an experiment is another kind of entity. Yeah, an experiment is a process. It has things that the experimenter does. It has variables that are controlled. It has results. It has conditions that the experiment was done under, especially for plant research. The weather, the time of year that you were doing the experiment all have an effect on the outcome. So this just shows you can start off with this very abstract BFO. You've gone through the gene ontology, the plant ontology, and now you've come right down here to the plant phenotyping ontology, and you're adding things like what project were you working on, who was the experimenter, which piece of national infrastructure equipment was being used. And the idea is every time anyone does an experiment on a plant now, it can get encoded in this standard ontology and put into the master database. And not only does it become available to all the other plant scientists, but it gets linked into the gene ontology and BFO. So potentially people from very distant fields could still make use of the knowledge contained in here. So yeah, good time to be an ontologist, right? This is ontology careers paying £100,000 a year or more. There are quite a lot of them, especially in these biological fields. But in a lot of these areas, you're going to be using an ontology someone else has made. In other cases, you are developing these ontologies and trying to grow them and make them compatible with one another. And the dream is they can all fit together and all of human knowledge will go in one database under one ontology of the three currently competing ones. And your AI system will be able to use logic and computation to answer questions about anything you like. That's the dream. It's the last lecture, so I'm going to waffle about cultural theory and the meaning of logic in the world that we live in. We touched on this the other day, right? Modern logic was created around the start of the 20th century, arguably by Frege a bit before. He got going at the start of the 20th century, and the dream was to put everything on new foundations. There was going to be one true theory of logic which could verify itself, and we would have this, what is called sincerity. We would all know that it was true in what are now big quotation marks, and everything would be done. There'd be one view of the world that was provably correct in terms of itself, and everyone could live in that world. What we have found is that what happens in logic affects everyone else. It goes out into other academic disciplines. It goes out into the culture that we live in. There's usually decades or even centuries later. And this feeling of modernism spread into everything. Architecture, painting, politics. There should be one perfect system of government that is proven to work. There should be a perfect system of music based on all 12 notes being equal to one another. A lot of those ideas didn't work out so well. You can't take theorems in logic and apply them to prove things about these other fields. You can't prove that some kind of architecture is better than another using Gödel's theorem. People have tried to claim that Gödel's theorem applies to everything. What you find instead is these other fields will come to logic and they will treat what's going on here as a source of inspiration, and that gives them ideas to go off in their own ways. So the physicists wanted to make one true theory of physics, and the politicians wanted to make one true theory of politics, because that's what everyone was talking about at the time. So since Gödel's theorem, that all fell apart because all these people were looking to logic as their inspiration, and the cornerstone of the whole thing collapsed. Gödel just put a bomb on the lot, and the foundations fell apart. And that in turn trickled into everything else. People then gave up on their systems of music and architecture and politics. And for most of the 20th century, we were in this state of postmodernism, right? Or just whatever comes after modernism. And it was characterized by taking that idea and applying it to everything else. So now no system is the perfect system. Everyone can have their own system. My beliefs are just as valid as your beliefs. My beliefs about not taking medicines to cure my cancer are just as valid as your beliefs that the medicines actually work. A lot of ideas in art and culture have been around this quotation. Everything is relative to everything else. Everything can be taken out of context and put in quotes, just like the quotes you see in Gödel's theorem when you're getting logic to talk about symbols representing logic. And this led to a lot of irony because nobody believed anything anymore, and it was fun to run around pretending to believe in something even though you really didn't. And a lot of art and culture of the time was developed as forms of irony. So where have we gone since then, right? Developments in logic precede developments everywhere else. So maybe by looking to logic, we can get some idea of where the rest of our culture is actually heading. And there is a lot of discussion now about what has been termed meta-modernism. And this means being meta about modernism, right? Modernism was putting everything on new foundations. Let's try and put modernism itself on new foundations, hence meta-modernism. Modernism had some nice things about it, being sincere, actually believing in stuff, having a purpose in life, a meaning of anything that wasn't completely relative to everything else. We'd quite like to have some of that back, please. At the same time, we realize that we cannot actually do that. We have seen in logic that any system is imperfect. There's always something that it can't do. There's always a different, arguably better system that could be used to look at it instead. But we've kind of come to this new balance of being able to use theories in all these domains and to take them seriously while we're in them, but maintaining the ability to step outside and look at them from outside as and when we need to. We know that no system is perfect. We know that there's always a better one, but we also know that we need some system that works and that we can find meaning inside. So, we want to keep these theories in their boxes and use them and genuinely believe in them to get on with our lives, but be prepared to jump out of it and see it all in quotes as and when it becomes necessary to do so. So in logic itself, there's become this new, more positive way of looking at these limitations. Okay, there's recently been a trend of people writing popular science books about what we cannot know. This is chitin again, the unknowable, the outer limits of reason. This is Marcus de Sautoy's What We Cannot Know. This is actually a really good book. Marcus de Sautoy came to Lincoln and he was just being a big male sexual organ trying to talk about deep learning when he didn't actually understand it. But this is a really good book where he's talking about Gödel's theorem and he actually does understand Gödel's theorem. Gary.
Yeah, I remember that. I was there watching. Watching. It was good.
That was quite fun, actually. Yeah, he really does know his stuff about logic and the limits of logic, and this is an excellent book that I would recommend. Not like his book about deep learning.
Yeah, the conversation was. But programs writing themselves.
Yeah. Maybe his next one will be automatic and put him out of a job. Yeah. All written in self-writing, syntactically connect Python code, I think I remember. So, all these books are trying to push towards this more positive way of dealing with those limitations. Now, there was a time when people studied Gödel's theorem and just went into this pit of despair that we can never know anything and logic is useless and civilization is over. What we have now is this idea, these paradoxes are there, but they're like they're like little black holes. CERN has this idea that there might be little tiny black holes all over the place that they could suck stuff in and be a mess, but they're tiny and they're very spread out, and so as long as you go around them, you aren't going to fall in, and they don't really matter. And these holes in logic and computation now seem to behave like that. We know that you can't build a perfect AI that can do everything. We know that it's always possible to come up with a question that's going to blow it up, or there's something that it can't do. But at the same time, there are things that it can do. And as long as you stay in the right region where things are going to work and don't go to those bad places, then maybe you can actually be okay, and your theory will be okay, and you can actually believe in your theory again. If you really need to go and use a bigger computer or a more powerful system, you can always do that. If you really need to investigate one of those places, and in the other places, there are good algorithms, there are good heuristics which will work most of the time in many cases, or at least some of the time. So you can create static analysis tools. You can have a career writing programs that detect whether other people's programs halt or not in some cases, and those cases can be very useful. And there's no limit to the extensions that can be made to those ideas. You can always find employment as a static analysis designer, looking at some new cases that the previous system wasn't able to handle. There's no limit. It's impossible to exhaust the set of algorithms and heuristics that can be created to capture more and more cases. So this is an inexhaustible supply of problems and opportunities and employment for the humans who work on them. And this is the feeling, this is what we could now look at as a meta-modernist feeling that you experience at most computer science and AI conferences, where you oscillate between a feeling of desperation that this is all pointless because the problems are unsolvable, and a feeling of hope and opportunity that actually every year people show up and they do provide theorems and proofs that extend knowledge of the field and cover more and more cases. You can't measure what percentage of cases are covered because there's infinitely many, and at any time we have some cases we can do and an infinity of cases that we can't. So there's this sense of oscillation that we're making progress and covering more cases, but at the same time we're not, because there's still infinitely many that cannot be covered. And I think this is a feeling that affects many people's careers in comp sci and AI. Are we making progress or are we not? We're oscillating between those feelings. And pragmatism is a philosophy that came ahead of its time in the 19th century in America. It should have appeared now. Pragmatism is the philosophy that truth is just a function of how useful is your theory. If your theory works, and ultimately if it makes money, if it helps you, then you should believe it sincerely and you use the theory. And in the cases where it doesn't work, you throw it out and go and find a different theory to believe in. And then maybe you come back to the theory you had in the first place when things change again and you need to work in that part of the world instead. And you can feel this dripping out into the rest of the world now. These ideas have come from logic. This new positive but limited view is now flowing out into fiction and science and religion and everything. This idea of oscillation. Sometimes you are working inside the system and you believe it, you are sincere about it, but at the same time you maintain the ability to pop outside and realize that the whole thing was just in a big pair of quotation marks and can be thrown away and replaced. So I think the most meta-modern piece of literature in the world is your teenage diary, right? When you're a teenager, you write about these epic events. You are the center of the world and the whole world is falling apart around you, or being put back together again on the next day. And from your point of view inside the system, inside the quotation marks, that is utterly sincere. It's an honest portrayal of what your world is like. The minute you step outside of the quotes, read someone else's diary, or Adrian Mole's diary is an early example of this. Teenage diaries are just hysterical to anyone reading them from the outside, because you know that this person doesn't matter at all. They're a tiny speck in the universe and in the country that they live in, and their actions are of no consequence at all. And it's hilarious that they view themselves in this way as the center of everything. But when you read The Secret Diaries of Adrian Mole, you can feel this metamodernist current now. You can read them in both ways. You can be inside the system and it's utterly sincere, or you can be outside the system and it's hilarious and ironic. And the way to read this is to see both perspectives at the same time, and both as equally valid. So you'll find this spilling out into fiction all over the place now. This idea of sincerity and irony coexisting. You can look at books like The Corrections, Infinite Jest, Modern Family, TV series, the Marvel movies. They play with sincerity and irony. If you're in the system of a Marvel superhero, it's utterly serious what's going on. It's the end of the world. But you step outside of it for a moment and it's completely ridiculous. And you have to see both perspectives, just like you do in a logical system. You find this in music. A.G. Cook, Capital Cities, Alison Gold's Chinese food song, all utterly sincere from the perspective of the singer and utterly ridiculous from the outside, and both equally valid points of view. You can find it in comedy. You can make jokes about things which are serious. You can make jokes about jokes. You can make meta jokes, strangely jokes, and so on. Very knowingly moving inside the quotes and outside the quotes. Certainly in science now, this pragmatist philosophy is everywhere. Does this theory work? Does this theory work for the purpose of getting funding for our research project? That's the theory we're actually going to believe in. That's what actually pays the bills. So you better believe that theory. It's often said all models are false, but some are useful, and that's pragmatism. I have felt metamodern about this book. Okay, this is my book, Data Science for Transport, and it was written as a joke. The whole thing was an ironic joke. I got asked to teach a course on data science and machine learning and cloud computing and big data and the Internet of Things, and this was all driven by financial funding reasons. So I deliberately created a course that was just the most ridiculous mixture of every buzzword I could find from trendy computer science. This book's all about the Internet of Clouds, right? And I define a bunch of new terms in it as well. As well as big data, I define medium-sized data, and I define artisan boutique small data, and all kinds of things. So it was created as a send-up of this management desire to teach trendy buzzwords. Anyway, the course was incredibly successful, and I was offered a book deal, and the book's now published, and many people are buying it, and I make decent money off it. And those people don't read the irony. They read it because they actually want to learn data science for transport, which is making them lots of money in their new careers as transport data scientists. And I no longer know whether to take the book ironically or seriously, or both. This is something that's been driven by the market. The author was ironic, the market was serious, and both of those things exist together. You will find this feeling in religion. You can apply this idea of pragmatism as it was originally intended to models of religion. You can be inside a religious system and believe every word of it for the purpose of doing religious stuff and being ethical and making yourself a better person. And then you can walk outside the church the next day and go back to believing in atoms and superstrings on Monday. And they're two different systems. You're allowed to switch between them at any time, be inside the quotes and be sincere and believe it and practice it and move to the other one as and when you need it. And this shows up in your career as well. You know, what do you actually believe? Do you believe that management techniques based around project deliverables and here the award of teaching awards, you know, everyone knows these things can be gamed. You know, you get a nice plastic trophy to put on your office desk for teacher of the year. Does it actually mean anything? But then, you know, look at it from outside and maybe it actually does. You know, maybe there is no better way of running a project than with a Gantt chart full of deliverables or giving out plastic teaching awards to encourage people to actually do stuff here. Yes, you can be inside the system, you can be outside. They're both equally valid perspectives. You know, and you're going to take whatever system makes the most money. If a theory works for you, if a logic works for you, if it gets the job done, you know, if a ontology works for you, if you need the world to contain certain entities that are important for what you're trying to do, you know, those are the things you will go out and do in your career. That's what makes the money. That's what's useful. That's what works. On that note, you can now forget all about intellectual academic things and go and do that. I wish you all the best of luck when you graduate and go into the outside world, and hopefully some of these theories will still be true for you precisely because they are useful and help you to make money.
Thank you very much.
This course is dedicated to my former boss, mentor, friend, Stephen Smith, one of many good people lost in the shit that has been 2020. He was working on amazing ideas in computation theory and logic and physics, and was always on the brink of discovering something very important for the world. He will be missed. I hope some of his ideas will stick around in the heads of you guys. A lot of the ideas in this course have come from Steve, so I hope there's a little bit of Steve floating out into the world in your own minds. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charles. It's been a great course. Really enjoyed it.